Hey dreamers, tonight we're stepping into one of mythology's most quietly fascinating beginnings, the origin of the very first Olympian, who would also become the last. This is the story of Hestia, the gentle heart of the gods, whose path starts in a way few would expect, and whose presence would come to hold Olympus together. And here's where the curiosity begins. How does the most peaceful of all the gods become the one who anchors their entire world? What makes Hestia so essential, even though she rarely takes the spotlight? And why does her story shake the harmony of Olympus more than any battle or prophecy ever could? Before we settle in, tap like if these stories help you unwind, and hit subscribe so you never miss a new mythic journey. And tell me in the comments which Greek goddess has always fascinated you the most. Let's return our gaze to a time before time itself had learned to keep proper records. We find ourselves in an age when the Titans held dominion over creation, when Cronus, the youngest of these ancient beings, had seized power from his father Uranus through an act so brutal it echoes across the ages still. Cronus now sat upon the throne of all things, his position seemingly unshakable, his rule absolute. He had clawed his way to the summit, and he was determined to remain there. It was during this reign of the Titans that Cronus took Rhea as his wife and consort. Rhea was herself a Titaness, one whose very essence was bound to the cycles of fertility, motherhood, and the gentle nurturing of new life. She embodied all the generative powers of creation, the warmth and softness that stands in stark contrast to the cold, metallic ambitions of her husband. Their union was fated to produce children, but Cronus carried with him a burden more terrible than any physical weight. A prophecy, whispered by forces older than the gods themselves, had reached his ears. It declared that one of his own children would one day rise against him, overthrowing his rule just as he had overthrown his father before him. This prophecy festered in Cronus's mind like a poison that would not dilute. It corrupted his joy at fatherhood before any child even drew breath. It transformed the hope of legacy into the dread of replacement. And so Cronus made a decision, one that was as elegant as it was necessarily complicated, a signature of divine project management at its most theatrical. He decided that the only way to prevent his downfall was to ensure his children never lived long enough to threaten him. None would grow. None would rebel. None would steal his throne. To accomplish this, he would devour each child the moment it entered the world, trapping them whole within his immortal belly, suspended in a state of eternal non-existence. It was on a particular morning, in a place where time moved differently than it does in our modern world, that Rhea gave birth to her first child. The moment was tender, sacred, the profound experience of new life emerging into consciousness. In her arms lay a glowing infant, her skin luminous with the soft radiance of divinity. Her name was Hestia, and she was the firstborn daughter of Cronus and Rhea. She was beautiful in the way that only divine newborns can be, perfect in every detail, her tiny fingers and toes a marvel of creation, her presence a blessing to behold. For just a fleeting moment, Rhea held her daughter close, feeling the warmth of new life against her heart. She could feel Hestia's innocence, her potential, all the magnificent futures that stretched ahead for this remarkable child. But that moment, that precious moment of peace, was destined to be devastatingly brief, because Cronus, consumed by his paranoia and fear, did not come to celebrate the birth of his daughter. He came to consume her. The image is almost too grotesque to contemplate. Cronus approached his wife with his mouth open wide, so impossibly wide that it seemed his jaw might unhinge from its moorings. Rhea, powerless to stop him, watched in mounting horror as her newborn daughter was swallowed whole by the one who should have been her protector. Little Hestia, only moments old, vanished into the gullet of her father. She did not die, for the gods cannot truly die, but she was imprisoned, trapped in an endless darkness, conscious but unreachable, suspended in the stomach of Cronus as though she were nothing more than food to be stored away. And then the cycle began again. a grim rhythm that would repeat with each birth. Demeter came next, beautiful Demeter, who would one day govern the harvests and the cycles of growth. She too was swallowed. Then came Hera, queenly and proud, marked for greatness, and she too disappeared into that same terrible darkness. Hades followed, then Poseidon. Each time, Rhea gave birth to a divine child. Each time, Cronus watched that child enter the world. Each time, he opened his impossibly wide mouth and swallowed the infant whole. To witness this, one must imagine the profound devastation that consumed Rhea's heart. Picture a mother who has lost every child to the same relentless hand, not to death, which carries at least the mercy of finality, but to a living imprisonment, a suspension of existence within the very being of their father. The grief was unimaginable. Each birth that should have been a moment of joy became instead a moment of horror, a preview of the agony that would follow. Rhea's despair grew with each swallowed child. She moved through the chambers of Cronus's palace like a ghost, remembering faces she would never see again, holding memories of warmth she could no longer access. But she did not allow her despair to consume her entirely. Deep within, something stirred. A determination born of a mother's fierce love, a determination that refused to accept that all her children would suffer this fate. She knew she had to act. She knew that somehow, against impossible odds, she had to find a way to save at least one child from her husband's terrible hunger. Rhea sought counsel from Gaia, the ancient earth herself, a being older than even the Titans, one who had witnessed the rise and fall of generations beyond counting. Gaia listened to the Titaness's plea, and from her ancient wisdom came a plan. It was a plan that required cunning, deception, and the kind of intimate knowledge of her husband's nature that Rhea possessed. The plan was simple in concept, but revolutionary in its audacity. When the time came for her sixth child to be born, a son who would grow to be called Zeus, Rhea would give birth in secret, hidden away in a cave on the distant island of Crete, where Cronus's gaze could not easily reach. The journey to Crete was itself arduous. Rhea, heavy with child and burdened by worry, travelled across the ancient world to find the place Gaia had shown her. She made her way to Mount Ida, where a sacred cave awaited, a place of refuge, a sanctuary where a newborn god could draw breath without immediate discovery. And there, in that twilight chamber deep within the earth, Zeus was born. His cries would echo through the cave, those sounds of a newborn's first breath, unheard by his father and therefore unheeded. Once Zeus was safely hidden away, Rhea turned her attention to the second part of her desperate scheme. She gathered swaddling clothes, the soft wrappings that would normally cradle an infant. But instead of wrapping her son, she wrapped something else. She took a stone, plain and unremarkable to human eyes, and bound it carefully in those same swaddling clothes. She concealed it with the kind of detail that speaks to her desperation. Every fold was perfect, every binding secure, every detail exactly as if she held her newborn in her arms. Then she returned to Cronus. She presented the bundle to him, her movements casual, her expression controlled despite the tempest raging within. And here, divine nature proved both blessing and curse to her deception. For in the moment she held the stone aloft, something truly remarkable occurred, something that ancient voices whispered about in reverent tones for ages to come. According to some tellings, Cronus asked her to nurse the stone one final time before he swallowed it. And when Rhea pressed her breast against the bundled rock, the milk that sprayed forth and spilled across the heavens created what mortals would one day call the Milky Way, a mark of her sacrifice written across the very sky itself. Then, without hesitation, Cronus swallowed the stone. His deception was complete, and he did not even realize it. He had consumed what he believed to be another child, another threat eliminated, another link in his chain of control secured. He felt satisfied, confident in his ability to maintain his dynasty. He did not taste the absence of flesh, the hollow feeling of a stone in his belly. His fear and paranoia blinded him to the obvious. Meanwhile, Hestia remained imprisoned in that darkness. Along with her siblings, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, she existed in a state of suspension, trapped within their father's body. They were not dead, but they were not truly alive either. They existed as consciousness without form, awareness without agency, potential without manifestation. How long they remained in that state, no mortal history can say. Time moves differently for the immortals. But Hestia was not lost to oblivion. She was not forgotten by fate or by the forces that govern destiny. She had been the first to enter Cronus's prison, and she would become, in a paradox that ancient people found absolutely fascinating, both the eldest and the youngest of the Olympian gods. For when Zeus would eventually grow to manhood, when he would confront his father and force him to disgorge his swallowed children, Hestia would be the first who had entered that dark tomb, and therefore the last who would emerge from it. Think about what that means, what it felt like to be swallowed before you could even open your eyes, to be trapped before you could truly live, and then to be reborn into a world that was ancient and complicated and filled with conflict. Honestly, which part of Hestia's story resonates most deeply with you? For me, it has to be the moment of her birth, that singular instant when she drew breath and existed for just a moment before everything changed. Because that makes her human somehow, despite her divinity. In that moment, we see the collision between two forces, the fierce love of a mother and the paralyzing fear of a father. We see innocence meeting cruelty before either can fully comprehend what is happening. Hestia's beginning was not a beginning at all, but rather the first of many paradoxes that would define her existence. She was born first, but awakened last. She was most senior, yet most junior. She was the most forgotten of all the Olympians, yet she would hold a place of honor in every household and every temple throughout all of ancient Greece. But that chapter of her story, her awakening, her emergence, her role on Mount Olympus, that is a tale for another telling. For now, we leave young Hestia suspended in that darkness, the first of her kind to be swallowed by Cronus, holding within her the entire promise of what the Olympian age would become, waiting for the day when Zeus would challenge his father and everything would be reborn into light. When Zeus finally came of age, when he had grown strong in his hidden sanctuary on Crete, nurtured by nymphs and protected by forces older than the Titans themselves, he returned to confront his father with a mixture of cunning and raw divine power that would reshape the cosmos forever. The confrontation was inevitable, written into the fabric of destiny itself, and when the moment arrived, Zeus brought with him a potion, a concoction designed to force Cronus to disgorge everything he had swallowed in his desperate attempts to cling to power. The Titan King, tricked and overpowered, felt his stomach convulse with a violence he could not control, and one by one he vomited up the children he had consumed. First the stone that Rhea had wrapped in swaddling clothes, and then, in reverse order of their consumption, the divine children themselves. The Mollier, Poseidon, emerged first, god of the seas and earthquakes, followed by Hades, lord of the unseen realm beneath the earth. Then came Hera, destined to become queen of the heavens, and Demeter, who would govern the cycles of harvest and growth. Each sibling emerged into the light, fully grown despite never having experienced childhood, their divine forms perfect and their consciousness sharp despite the years spent in that terrible darkness. And finally, last to emerge because she had been first to enter, came Hestia, eldest by birth, youngest by liberation, caught forever in that beautiful paradox that would define so much of her nature. Imagine what that moment must have felt like for her. The sudden rush of light after endless darkness, the first true breath after suspension in that timeless void, the awakening of senses that had been trapped and dormant for so long. She stood among her siblings, these gods and goddesses who were strangers to her despite sharing blood and experience, and she found herself thrust into a world already in motion, already complicated by forces she could barely comprehend. The war between the Titans and the Olympians, the Titanomachy, as it would come to be called, was about to begin in earnest, a conflict that would rage for 10 years and shake the very foundations of existence. Her brothers and sisters took up arms in that war, each claiming their domains through battle and proving their worth through conflict. Zeus wielded his thunderbolts, Poseidon his trident, Hades his helm of darkness. Hera and Demeter contributed their powers to the struggle, and together the Olympians fought against their father and his generation of titans for control of creation itself. But Hestia did not take up weapons. She did not march into battle with the fierce determination that characterized her siblings. Instead, she remained behind, tending to something far more fundamental, far more essential to the survival of her family than any sword or spear could ever be. She claimed as her domain the hearth, that sacred space where fire burns continuously, where warmth radiates outward, where families gather and communities form. In ancient Greece, the hearth was not merely a practical necessity for cooking and warmth, though it was certainly both of those things. The hearth was the spiritual center of the home, the axis around which domestic life revolved, the place where the essence of family was most tangibly felt. It was the first thing established when a new home was built, and the last thing abandoned when a home was left behind. To let the hearth fire go out was considered a terrible omen, a sign that the family's fortunes had turned dark, that protection and unity had been compromised. 2. Hestia understood this in a way that transcended mere intellectual knowledge. She felt it in the core of her being, this profound truth about fire and home and the way they intertwine to create something greater than the sum of their parts. While her siblings fought for dominion over seas and skies and underworlds, Hestia chose the hearth, and in doing so, she chose something that would touch every single life in ways both grand and intimate. Her domain was not the dramatic realm of storms or the mysterious depths of the ocean. It was the quiet, constant presence of the fire that burns in the center of the home, the flame that transforms raw ingredients into nourishment, cold spaces into warm ones, and separate individuals into a unified family. When the war finally ended, when the Titans were defeated and cast into Tartarus, when Zeus claimed the throne of Olympus and divided the cosmos among his siblings, Hestia received her place of honor. Zeus, recognizing the essential nature of her role, granted her privileges that reflected both respect and deep understanding. She would receive the first offering in every sacrifice, the richest portion of every ritual feast. In every temple built to honor the gods, Hestia would have her share of reverence. In every home, from the grandest palace to the humblest dwelling, her presence would be felt in the hearth fire that burned there. But Olympus itself needed a hearth, and this became Hestia's primary responsibility, one she embraced with a dedication that bordered on the sacred. While the other Olympians travelled widely, involving themselves in the affairs of mortals and immortals alike, engaging in romances and rivalries and all manner of complicated entanglements, Hestia remained at home. The great hall of Zeus, the gathering place of the gods, required someone to maintain its fire, to ensure that warmth and light never failed, to create the conditions under which the divine family could function. This was not a burden to her. It was her purpose, her calling, the way she chose to express her divine nature. Somber, picture her there in the center of Olympus, tending the eternal flame with hands that moved with practiced grace. She became the still point around which the often chaotic energies of the other Olympians could orbit. When Zeus thundered and Hera raged, when Poseidon churned the seas in anger and Ares gloried in conflict, when Aphrodite stirred passions and Apollo pursued excellence with relentless intensity, through all of it Hestia remained centered, calm, present at the hearth, maintaining the fire that symbolized the unity of the Olympian family, even when that unity seemed most fragile. Her choice to claim this domain was not an abdication of power, but rather a different expression of it, a power that worked through presence rather than force, through constancy rather than drama, through the quiet maintenance of essential things rather than the loud assertion of personal will. In a pantheon filled with gods who sought glory through conquest and love affairs and grand dramatic gestures, Hestia represented something profoundly different. She represented the power of staying, of tending, of creating and maintaining the spaces where others could thrive. The mortals understood this better than many of the gods themselves. In every Greek home, the hearth fire burned in Hestia's honour, and the first portion of every meal was offered to her before anyone else ate. When a bride left her father's house to join her husband's family, she carried fire from her childhood hearth to kindle the fire in her new home, a ritual that honoured Hestia and symbolised the continuity of family and the creation of new bonds while maintaining old ones. When colonies were established in distant lands, fire from the mother city's public hearth, the Prytaneum, where Hestia's eternal flame burned as a symbol of civic unity, was carried to light the first fire in the new settlement. This public dimension of Hestia's domain was just as important as the private one, though often less celebrated in the dramatic retellings that focus on adventure and conflict. The Prytaneum served as the spiritual centre of the Greek city-state, and the fire that burned there in Hestia's name was never allowed to go out. It represented the continuity of the community, the stability of civic life, the bonds that held citizens together as something more than just a collection of individuals. To tend this fire was a sacred duty, often entrusted to priestesses who dedicated their lives to maintaining the flame and ensuring that Hestia's presence blessed the entire city. In this way, Hestia's influence extended from the most intimate domestic spaces to the largest civic structures, from the family meals shared around the hearth to the communal feasts that brought entire cities together in celebration and sacrifice. She was, in the truest sense, both the most private and the most public of goddesses, present in every home yet also present in every shared space where people gathered to affirm their bonds and celebrate their unity. But there was more to her choice of domain than practical function and symbolic meaning. There was also a deeper philosophical truth about the nature of fire itself and what it represents in human experience. Fire is transformative, turning the raw into the cooked, the cold into the warm, the dark into the light. Fire is both creative and destructive, capable of providing life-sustaining warmth and equally capable of consuming everything in its path. To be the goddess of the hearth fire was to be the goddess of controlled transformation, of fire in its most beneficial and life-affirming aspect, of flame that has been domesticated and put to use in service of human flourishing. The Greeks understood fire as a gift from the gods, famously stolen by Prometheus and given to humanity, enabling civilization itself to develop. But Hestia's relationship with fire was different from Prometheus's dramatic theft and punishment. Where Prometheus represented the dangerous acquisition of divine power, Hestia represented the proper, sanctified use of that power fire as it should be. Fire as a blessing rather than a threat. Fire contained and controlled and channeled toward constructive ends. Her presence at the hearth transformed fire from a wild, dangerous force into a sacred, nurturing one. She became, in essence, the stabilizing force of Olympus, not through dramatic interventions or powerful displays of might, but through the simple, profound act of remaining present and tending the fire. When conflicts erupted among the Olympians, as they so often did, Hestia did not take sides. When love affairs and betrayals complicated the relationships between gods, she remained above the fray. When Zeus's philandering angered Hera, when Athena and Poseidon competed for Athens, when Apollo and Artemis took vengeance on those who insulted their mother through all the drama and conflict that characterized life on Olympus, Hestia maintained her focus on the hearth, creating a space of peace and neutrality that served as a refuge for all. This neutrality was not indifference. It was wisdom. Hestia understood that families, whether mortal or divine, require someone who stands outside the conflicts, who maintains the space where reconciliation becomes possible, who holds the center while others move in passionate orbits around it. Her gentle nature was not weakness, but rather a different kind of strength, one that expressed itself through endurance, through constancy, through the patient tending of the flame that must never go out. The ancient sources tell us that when Apollo and Poseidon both sought her hand in marriage, Hestia refused them both. This was no small thing to refuse. Two of the most powerful gods of Olympus required both courage and deep conviction about her own path. Apollo, god of light and prophecy and music, and Poseidon, lord of all the seas, were certainly formidable suitors, and many goddesses would have been honoured to accept either one. But Hestia saw clearly that marriage would compromise her ability to fulfill her true purpose. She approached Zeus and swore an oath, placing her hand on his head in a gesture of solemn binding. She vowed to remain a virgin forever, unmarried and unattached, devoted entirely to her role as keeper of the hearth. The oath itself is worth contemplating, because it represents a choice that stands in stark contrast to the usual expectations placed on goddesses in Greek mythology. Where most divine females were defined by their relationships with male gods or their roles as mothers, Hestia defined herself by her function, by her service, by her dedication to a purpose that transcended romantic or familial entanglements. Zeus honoured her oath and granted her additional privileges in recognition of her choice. She would have the place of highest honour at the divine feasts, receiving the first and richest portions of every sacrifice. She would be revered in every temple alongside whichever god that temple primarily honoured. Her virginity became not a limitation, but a source of power. It kept her free from the complications that entangled so many other deities, allowing her to remain focused on her essential purpose. Along with Athena and Artemis, Hestia became one of the three virgin goddesses of Olympus, each expressing their independence and power in different ways. Athena's virginity was tied to her role as warrior and strategist, maintaining a kind of masculine independence in a female form. Artemis's virginity was connected to her wildness, her domain over untamed nature, and her role as protector of young women. But Hestia's virginity was different from both. It was about maintaining purity, not in the sense of innocence, but in the sense of singularity of purpose, of remaining undivided in attention and dedication. Fire itself is pure. It cannot be contaminated. It purifies through consumption and transformation. Hestia's virginity mirrored this quality of fire, this essential purity that made her the appropriate guardian of the sacred flame. In her hands, the hearth fire became a symbol of everything good and wholesome about domestic life: warmth without harm, transformation without destruction, light without consuming flame. The Greeks who honoured her understood that every meal was a kind of sacrifice, every family gathering a religious ritual, every moment spent around the hearth a recognition of divine presence. The preparation of bread, the most fundamental of foods, fell under Hestia's domain, transforming raw grain into nourishing sustenance through the application of fire and skill. The cooking pot and kettle became her symbols, humble objects elevated to sacred status because of their connection to her and to the essential work of feeding and nurturing family. Honestly, there's something deeply moving about this choice, the way Hestia embraced what others might have seen as a lesser domain and revealed it to be absolutely essential. In a world that celebrated the dramatic and the spectacular, she celebrated the daily and the necessary. In a pantheon that valued power expressed through conquest and dominion, she valued power expressed through care and maintenance. She was, in many ways, the most radical of all the Olympians, precisely because she rejected the usual pathways to glory and chose something quieter, deeper, more fundamental. Her presence on Olympus created a kind of anchor point, a stable centre around which the more volatile energies of the other gods could safely revolve. When Zeus held court and made his pronouncements, when the Olympians gathered for their feasts and councils, when decisions were made that would affect gods and mortals alike, all of this happened in the warmth of Hestia's fire, in the space she had created and maintained through her patient, constant tending. The philosophers would later recognize something profound in this arrangement. They would see in Hestia a principle of cosmic order, a representation of the center that must hold for everything else to function. Plato himself suggested that Hestia remained in the house of the gods, while all the others processed through the heavens, that her staying was not a limitation but a necessity, that someone had to maintain the center for the periphery to have meaning. She was both privilege and responsibility, both honor and burden, the one who stayed so others could go, the one who tended so others could adventure, the one who maintained so others could transform. In every Greek home, her influence was felt in the most intimate moments of daily life. The morning fire kindled to begin the day, the evening meal shared in the warmth of the hearth, the stories told and bonds strengthened around the flame. Children grew up in the glow of Hestia's fire, learning the rhythms of family life, absorbing the values of unity and care that the hearth represented. Marriages began and ended at the hearth. Births were celebrated there. Deaths were mourned there. All the major transitions of human life occurred in spaces sacred to Hestia, marked by her presence and blessed by her gentle power. And so she became the goddess of the home, not just as a physical structure, but as a concept, as the idea of belonging and safety, and the place where one is fully known and fully accepted. She was the goddess of family in all its complicated beauty, the bonds that sustain us, the relationships that shape us, the connections that give our lives meaning beyond our individual existence. She protected these things not with weapons or threats, but with the steady maintenance of the fire, with the quiet work of creating and preserving the spaces where love and connection could flourish. Her story asks us to reconsider what we mean by power, what we value as important, what we honor as sacred. In Hestia, we see the power of presence over absence, of constancy over change, of the center over the periphery. We see a goddess who claimed her domain not through conquest, but through choice, who wielded influence not through force, but through the creation of sacred space, who achieved immortality in human hearts, not through grand myths of adventure, but through the daily experience of warmth, nourishment, and home. She became the gentle stabilizing force of Olympus, and in doing so, she became something even more remarkable. She became essential, irreplaceable, the one deity whose absence would cause the entire system to collapse. For what is Olympus without a hearth? What is a family of gods without the fire that brings them together? What is power and glory and adventure worth if there is no home to return to, no center to hold, no warmth to sustain us through the cold and dark? Hestia understood these questions in her very essence, and she answered them not with words, but with the steady, faithful tending of the flame, first to be born, last to emerge, forever dwelling at the center, keeping the fire alive so that all others might live in its warmth and light. The moment arrived without warning, as such moments often do. Apollo, god of light and prophecy, music and healing, whose presence could illuminate the darkest corners of creation, turned his attention toward Hestia with the kind of focused intensity that had won the hearts of countless nymphs and mortals alike. He was magnificent in every sense that a god could be. Beautiful beyond measure, powerful beyond comprehension, talented in ways that made even other immortals pause in admiration. His lyre could make stones weep, and rivers change their courses. His arrows never missed their mark. His prophecies shaped the destiny of nations. He was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary suitor, one who could offer status and adventure, glory and excitement, all the things that gods typically valued and pursued with passionate determination. But Apollo was not the only deity who looked upon Hestia and saw something worth claiming as his own. Poseidon, lord of all the seas and shaker of the earth itself, whose trident commanded the waves and whose moods could drown cities or grant safe passage to sailors, he too approached Hestia with marriage on his mind. Poseidon's domain stretched across 3/4 of the world's surface. His palace beneath the waves was said to rival Olympus itself in grandeur, and his power was second only to Zeus among all the gods. He was wild and unpredictable, passionate and fierce, a force of nature given divine form and consciousness. Think about what it must have meant to receive marriage proposals from two such formidable deities, Apollo and Poseidon, light and water, prophecy and power, both standing among the most influential figures in the entire pantheon. For most goddesses, for most beings divine or mortal, such attention would have been the pinnacle of achievement, the fulfillment of every ambition. To be chosen by Apollo or Poseidon was to be recognized as exceptional, worthy, deserving of standing alongside greatness. The honor alone would have satisfied many, and the practical benefits of such a union would have been considerable. Increased status on Olympus, powerful allies, the possibility of divine children who would carry forward both parents' legacies. But Hestia looked at these proposals with eyes that saw clearly beyond the surface glamour to the deeper truth of what marriage would mean for her. Specifically, for the path she had chosen, for the purpose she had already begun to understand as central to her existence. She saw that marriage to Apollo, for all his brilliance and beauty, would mean constant movement, endless journeys across the mortal world, involvement in the complicated politics of Olympus, participation in conflicts and dramas that held no interest for her. Apollo was perpetually in motion, racing his sun chariot across the sky, visiting his oracle at Delphi, pursuing romantic interests, engaging in contests of skill and demonstrations of power. To be his wife would mean being pulled into that orbit, becoming a satellite to his sun, losing the centered stillness that she had come to recognize as essential to her nature and her function. Tubal and Poseidon. Well, Poseidon was even more complicated, wasn't he? His temperament matched his domain, stormy and changeable, capable of tremendous generosity one moment and destructive rage the next. The god of the seas was already entangled in various romantic relationships, already had commitments and children scattered across the world. Marriage to him would mean navigating the turbulent waters of his moods, dealing with the complications that came with his other affairs, possibly finding herself in conflict with his other lovers and consorts. It would mean leaving the hearth to dwell beneath the waves or to travel the coastlines, to be associated with the wild unpredictability of the ocean rather than the steady constancy of the fire. More fundamentally, Hestia understood something that perhaps Apollo and Poseidon did not fully grasp. She understood that what they desired was not truly her, not the essence of who she was becoming, but rather the idea of possessing something pure and unclaimed, the satisfaction of winning where others might compete. Because here was the deeper truth. Multiple gods were interested in her hand, and the choosing of one would inevitably create resentment in the others who were passed over. The rejected suitors would carry their disappointment, and knowing the temperament of the Olympians, that disappointment could easily curdle into something more dangerous: rivalry, conflict, the kind of divine feuding that could shake the foundations of the world. Hestia had watched her siblings at war with the Titans, had seen what conflict among gods could do, had witnessed the destruction and chaos that followed when immortal beings allowed their passions and pride to drive their actions. She had no desire to become the catalyst for yet another divine conflict, no wish to be the prize over which Apollo and Poseidon might come to blows, threatening the fragile peace that the Olympians had only recently established after their victory in the Titanomachy. The prospect horrified her, that her choice of husband could fracture the unity of Olympus, could create fault lines that might widen over millennia. But beyond these practical considerations, beyond the politics and the potential for conflict, there was something even more essential at stake. Hestia's own understanding of her purpose, her calling, the reason she had emerged from Cronus's belly and taken her place among the Olympians. She had already begun to tend the hearth of Olympus, had already discovered the profound satisfaction that came from maintaining that sacred fire, had already felt the rightness of remaining at the center, while others moved in orbits around her. Marriage would fundamentally compromise her ability to fulfill this purpose. Because the hearth requires a keeper who is fully present, fully devoted, whose attention is not divided between the fire and a spouse, between the home and the expectations that come with being someone's wife. In ancient Greek society, marriage meant specific obligations. A wife was expected to support her husband's interests, to participate in his sphere of influence, to produce children and raise them in ways that honoured the family line. Even among gods, these expectations held force. These patterns shaped relationships and defined roles. Hestia saw clearly that accepting marriage would mean accepting these obligations, and in doing so, she would necessarily have to diminish her dedication to the hearth. Her role was among mortals, not in the dramatic interactions of Olympus. Her influence manifested in human homes and communities, in the daily rituals of lighting fires and sharing meals, in the quiet moments of family gathering that occurred around hearths across the Greek world. Marriage to another powerful deity would force her into greater visibility among the Olympians, would create expectations of involvement in divine affairs, would demand her presence at events and councils, and all the complicated social maneuvering that characterized life on Olympus. She would be expected to form alliances, to support her husband's positions, to involve herself in matters that had nothing to do with hearth and home. And children. The expectation would certainly be that she would bear divine children, who would then need her attention and care, who would involve her in the typical divine parenting that seemed to consist mainly of dramatic interventions in mortal affairs and complicated relationships with half-siblings and rivals. Hestia had no desire for such complications. She had seen what motherhood looked like for Rhea, had witnessed the pain of her mother's losses, had emerged from darkness into a world where family relationships among gods seemed defined more by conflict than by love. The prospect of repeating these patterns held no appeal. So Hestia made her choice, a choice that would define her for all eternity, a choice that stood in stark contrast to the usual expectations for goddesses in the Greek pantheon. She approached her brother Zeus, the one who had freed her and her siblings from their father's belly, the one who now ruled as king of the gods from his throne on Olympus. This moment required courage, because what she intended to ask was unprecedented, radical in ways that might not be immediately obvious, but were nonetheless profound. Tile. She placed her hand on Zeus's head. The gesture itself was significant, formal, carrying the weight of deep seriousness and unbreakable commitment. In that gesture, she invoked Zeus not just as her brother, but as the highest authority among the gods, as the one whose word was law, whose blessing could legitimize her choice and protect her from future pressure to reconsider. And then she spoke the words that would change everything, the oath that would set her apart from nearly every other goddess in the pantheon. She swore to remain a virgin forever. Let that sink in for a moment. The completeness of this vow, the absoluteness of the commitment she was making. Not, I will remain unmarried for now. Not, I prefer to focus on my duties at present, but rather an eternal, unbreakable oath of perpetual virginity, sworn by the head of Zeus himself, which meant that breaking it would be impossible, unthinkable. A violation so severe that it could shake the very foundations of divine order. She was choosing to remove herself completely from the marriage market, to make herself permanently unavailable, to declare once and for all that she would never be anyone's wife, never be anyone's lover, never participate in the romantic and sexual dimensions of existence that seemed to dominate so much of divine life. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite captures this moment beautifully, describing how Hestia, wholly unwilling, nay, stubbornly refused the marriage proposals, how she touched the head of Zeus who holds the aegis and swore a great oath which has in truth been fulfilled, that she would be a maiden all her days. The language is striking. Stubbornly refused suggests not gentle demurral but firm, unyielding rejection, a determination that would not be swayed by pressure or persuasion. She knew her own mind completely, and she would not be moved from her purpose. Zeus listened to her oath, And here we see something remarkable about his character, a side of the king of the gods that often gets lost in the stories about his many affairs and his sometimes tyrannical rule. He recognized the wisdom in Hestia's choice, understood that what she was asking for was not a rejection of responsibility, but rather a different way of being responsible, not an escape from purpose, but a deeper commitment to it. He accepted her vow, and, more than that, he honored it by granting her specific privileges that would elevate her status and ensure that her choice to remain unmarried would not diminish her standing among the Olympians. Zeus decreed that instead of marriage, Hestia would receive a high honor. She would have her place in the midst of the house, the center of Olympus itself, and she would receive the richest portion of all sacrifices. In all the temples built to honor the gods, Hestia would have a share of the honor, her name invoked, her presence acknowledged. Among all mortal humans, she would be recognized as chief of the goddesses, in terms of the reverence paid to her in domestic worship. These privileges were not consolation prizes for giving up marriage. They were recognition that her chosen path was itself honorable, valuable, worthy of the highest respect. This is the moment where we need to pause and really think about what Hestia accomplished here, because it's easy to let the details pass by without fully grasping their revolutionary nature. She claimed for herself the right to define her own existence outside the usual categories that applied to goddesses. She refused to be someone's wife, someone's sexual partner, someone's mother, all the roles that typically define divine females in Greek mythology. Instead, she defined herself by her function, by her service, by her relationship to the sacred fire and to the communities of mortals who depended on her presence at their hearths. Her virginity was not about innocence or ignorance or fear of sexuality. It was about autonomy, about maintaining complete independence from the obligations and entanglements that would inevitably come with marriage or romantic relationships. It was about purity in the sense of singularity of purpose, of remaining undivided in her attention and dedication. Fire cannot be contaminated, and Hestia's virginity mirrored this quality of fire. She remained pure as flame is pure, focused as flame is focused, constant as a well-tended fire is constant. She joined Athena and Artemis as one of the three virgin goddesses of Olympus, but her virginity expressed itself differently from theirs. Athena's virginity was tied to her role as a warrior and strategist, allowing her to operate in traditionally male spheres without being constrained by the expectations placed on wives and mothers. Artemis's virginity connected to her wildness, her association with untamed nature, and her role as protector of young girls before they reached marriageable age. But Hestia's virginity was something else entirely. It was about creating and maintaining sacred domestic space, about serving as the spiritual center of family and community without being bound to any particular family through marriage. This choice freed her to belong to everyone, and therefore to no one specifically. Because she was not Apollo's wife, she could be equally present to all the gods without showing favoritism. Because she was not Poseidon's consort, she could maintain neutrality when conflicts arose, could remain the peaceful center while storms raged around her. Her virginity ensured her independence, and her independence enabled her to fulfill her purpose as keeper of the hearth for all of Olympus, for all of Greece, for all of humanity. The wisdom of her choice became apparent in the years and centuries that followed, as the Olympians settled into their roles and their relationships grew increasingly complicated. Zeus's many affairs created constant tension with Hera, leading to conflicts that affected gods and mortals alike. Poseidon's romantic entanglements generated their own complications, rivalries with other gods, vendettas against those who rejected or betrayed him. Apollo pursued love after love, sometimes successfully and sometimes tragically, each relationship adding layers of complexity to his existence. Through all of this, Hestia remained apart, untouched by such drama, free to focus entirely on the fire. Her vow created a protected space around her, because she was sworn to eternal virginity by an oath made on Zeus's head. Even gods who might have been tempted to pursue her despite her initial refusal knew that such pursuit would be futile and disrespectful of the highest order. The oath functioned as both declaration and defense, making clear her boundaries in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. She had removed herself from the complicated marketplace of divine romance and marriage, had stepped outside the usual patterns of pursuit and conquest that characterized relationships among the Olympians. This didn't mean that her choice was always understood or respected by all. Later myths would sometimes suggest attempts to violate her virginity, stories that reflected mortal anxieties and fascinations more than divine reality. But the oath stood firm, Zeus's blessing held, and Hestia remained true to her vow throughout all of time. She became the embodiment of constancy itself, her virginity a kind of eternal flame that never flickered or dimmed. The devotion she chose instead of romantic love was devotion to the hearth, to the fire, to the families and communities that depended on her presence. She poured all the care and attention that might have gone to a spouse or children into tending the flames, into ensuring that warmth and light never failed, into creating the conditions where others could gather safely and live in harmony. Her love was expressed not through romantic attachment, but through service, through the patient, constant work of maintaining sacred space. In ancient Greek worship, the fruits of her choice became tangible in the most intimate moments of daily life. Every time a mother lit the morning fire, Hestia's presence blessed the act. Every time a family gathered for a meal and offered the first portion to the goddess of the hearth, they honored her decision to remain devoted to them rather than to a divine spouse. Every time a bride carried fire from her childhood home to her new household, she participated in Hestia's eternal virginity, the fire itself remaining pure, unchanged, constant, passed from generation to generation without being diminished or contaminated. The state religion mirrored this personal devotion in grand public ceremonies. In the Prytaneum of every Greek city, an eternal flame burned in Hestia's honor, tended by priestesses who had themselves often taken vows of chastity, dedicating their lives to maintaining the sacred fire, just as Hestia maintained the hearth of Olympus. These priestesses understood something of what Hestia's choice meant, the power that comes from dedication to a purpose beyond personal romantic fulfillment, the satisfaction of serving something larger than oneself. Honestly, there's something profoundly moving about the completeness of Hestia's commitment, the way she embraced her path with such clarity and conviction that it becomes impossible to imagine her having chosen differently. She didn't refuse Apollo and Poseidon with regret or reluctance. She refused them with the kind of certainty that comes from deep self-knowledge, from understanding exactly who she was meant to be and what she was meant to do. Her vow of eternal virginity wasn't a sacrifice of happiness, but rather the claiming of a different kind of happiness, one rooted in purpose and service rather than in romantic fulfillment. The peace she found in this choice radiated outward, creating ripples that touched every aspect of Greek religious and domestic life. Because Hestia was at peace with herself, utterly content in her role as keeper of the hearth, she could create peaceful spaces for others. Her temples were places of sanctuary. Her hearth fires were gathering points for reconciliation. Her presence was invoked whenever harmony and unity were needed. She became what she had chosen to become, a gentle, stabilizing force, a constant presence, a goddess whose power expressed itself through constancy rather than change, through presence rather than action, through the quiet maintenance of what mattered most. The purity she embodied was not the purity of ignorance or inexperience. It was the purity of conscious choice, of intentional dedication, of knowing exactly what she was giving up and choosing gladly to give it up, because what she gained was so much more valuable. She gained freedom from the complications that entangled the other Olympians, freedom to focus completely on her purpose, freedom to serve without being constrained by competing loyalties or divided attention. And the devotion she offered to the hearth, to the fire, to the families and communities under her protection, this devotion was complete, total, holding nothing back. She gave to the work of tending the flame everything she might have given to a husband or children, all the care and attention and fierce protective love that defines the best of relationships, but directed towards something that would never betray her, never leave her, never demand from her anything that conflicted with her essential nature. The fire became her beloved, in a sense. She knew its moods, understood its needs, tended it with a devotion that bordered on worship. She knew exactly how much fuel to add to keep it burning steadily, knew when it needed stirring and when it needed to be left alone, knew the difference between a healthy flame and one that was struggling. This intimate knowledge came from constant presence, from years and centuries of never leaving, of always being there to watch and tend and care. In this way, Hestia's vow of eternal virginity became not a limitation, but a liberation, not a rejection of connection, but a different way of being connected, not a denial of love, but a redirection of it towards something that could never be lost or taken away. The hearth would always need a keeper. The fire would always require tending. Families would always need a center around which to gather. And Hestia, by choosing to dedicate herself completely to this purpose, ensured that these needs would always be met, that this essential function would never be neglected or abandoned. She chose peace over passion, purity over complexity, devotion to purpose over devotion to a person. And in doing so, she became something unique among all the Olympians, a goddess whose power came not from what she did, but from what she was, not from dramatic interventions, but from steady presence, not from change, but from the promise that some things would never change. The fire would burn, the hearth would be tended, and Hestia would be there, eternal and constant. The virgin goddess whose choice to remain forever pure became the foundation of domestic life for all of ancient Greece. The eternal flame on Mount Olympus was not simply fire. It was something more fundamental, more essential, more deeply woven into the fabric of divine existence than mortals could easily comprehend. This was Hestia's primary duty, the responsibility she had claimed for herself when she refused marriage and swore her oath of eternal virginity. To tend the sacred fire, to ensure that it never flickered out, to maintain the burning heart of Olympus itself. Zeus had assigned her this role formally, decreeing that she would feed and maintain the fires of the Olympian hearth with the fatty, combustible portions of animal sacrifices that mortals offered to the gods. But the assignment merely formalized what Hestia had already chosen, what she already understood as her calling. Picture her there, in the great hall at the center of Olympus, where the divine family gathered for their councils and feasts, where decisions were made that would ripple across the cosmos and shape the destinies of gods and mortals alike. The hearth stood at the very center of this space, and at the hearth stood Hestia, hands moving with practiced grace as she tended the flame that had burned continuously since the moment the Olympians claimed their victory over the Titans. She added fuel when needed, adjusted the wood to ensure proper airflow, used tools forged by Hephaestus himself to manage the sacred fire that must never be allowed to die. This was not the wild, dangerous fire that Prometheus had stolen from the gods and given to humanity. This was fire domesticated, fire sanctified, fire that had been transformed from a force of nature into a symbol of unity and continuity. The flame represented the cohesion of the Olympian family, the bonds that held Zeus and his siblings together despite their frequent conflicts and complicated relationships. As long as the fire burned, Olympus itself remained intact, functional, a place where the divine family could gather and maintain some semblance of unity, even in the midst of their various feuds and rivalries. Hestia understood the profound symbolism of her work in a way that perhaps even the other Olympians did not fully grasp. Every time she added wood to the fire, she was reinforcing the bonds of family. Every time she ensured that the flame burned bright and steady, she was creating the conditions where the other gods could function, where they could pursue their various domains and interests, knowing that there was always a center to return to, always a hearth where they belonged. Her tending of the flame was not mere maintenance. It was an act of continuous creation. of sustaining the very structure that made Olympian life possible. The flame never went out, not in 1,000 years, not in 10,000, because Hestia was always there, always present, always watchful. While Zeus travelled to pursue his various romantic interests, while Poseidon stirred up storms in the oceans below, while Athena involved herself in the affairs of mortal heroes, and Apollo raced his sun chariot across the sky, through all of this constant movement and activity, Hestia remained stationary, anchored to the hearth, tending the flame that held everything together. Her staying was what enabled all their going, her constancy what made possible all their changes. The Greeks understood this instinctively, which is why they believed that if Hestia's flame were to be extinguished, it would bring cold and barren existence to the world. The fire was life itself, warmth in the face of the void, light against the darkness, the organizing principle around which civilization could form and flourish. To let it go out would be catastrophic, a failure so complete that it would threaten the very foundations of existence. This is why Hestia's dedication was so crucial, why her choice to remain forever at the hearth was not a limitation, but rather the accepting of a burden that no one else could properly bear. But Hestia's flame was not confined to Olympus. It reached down into the mortal world in ways both intimate and grand, touching every level of Greek society, from the individual household to the city-state itself. In every home, the hearth fire burned in her honor, a reflection of the greater flame she tended on Olympus, a connection between mortal families and the divine realm. When a Greek family lit their hearth fire in the morning, they were participating in Hestia's eternal work, joining their small flame to her great one, affirming their place in the cosmic order she maintained. This connection between the divine hearth and mortal hearths was made tangible through ritual practice that recognized Hestia as the protector of the home and the guardian of family unity. Every sacrifice began with an offering to Hestia. The first portions of every meal were given to her before anyone else, even before Zeus himself. Because the hearth came first, the center had to be honored before attention could turn to other concerns. This practice acknowledged that without the hearth, without the fire, without the center that Hestia maintained, nothing else could function. Not family, not community, not civilization itself. The most profound expression of this connection occurred when a new household was established, when a bride left her father's home to join her husband's family and create a new branch of the family tree. Fire would be taken from the hearth of the bride's childhood home fire that had burned there in Hestia's honor, that represented the continuity of that family line, and carried carefully to the new household, where it would be used to kindle the first fire in the new hearth. This ritual was more than symbolic. It was understood as an actual transfer of Hestia's blessing, a way of ensuring that the new family would be protected and sustained by the same divine presence that had watched over previous generations. The bride, in carrying this flame, became for a moment a priestess of Hestia, a guardian of the sacred fire, responsible for ensuring that the goddess's presence would bless the new home she was about to create. The act required careful attention. The flame could not be allowed to go out during the journey, because to lose the fire would be to lose Hestia's blessing, to start the new household without the divine protection that was considered absolutely essential for domestic happiness and prosperity. In this way, every Greek marriage became an extension of Hestia's work, every new family a new hearth tended in her honor. But the significance of Hestia's flame extended even beyond the individual household into the civic realm, where it took on dimensions that were simultaneously political, social, and deeply spiritual. In the center of every Greek city-state stood a building called the Prytaneum, which housed the communal hearth of the polis. This was not just any fire. This was the sacred flame of the entire community, the spiritual heart of the city itself, burning perpetually in Hestia's honor, just as her flame burned perpetually on Olympus. The Prytaneum served as Hestia's official sanctuary within the city, a place where her presence was invoked to watch over, and protect not just individual families, but the collective life of all citizens. The eternal flame that burned there represented the unity of the community, the shared heritage that bound citizens together, the continuity of civic identity across generations. This fire was tended with the same care and devotion that Hestia herself gave to the Olympian flame, often by priestesses who had dedicated their lives to maintaining it, who understood that allowing the flame to die would be a catastrophic failure, a sign that the city itself had lost its connection to the divine order. In Olympia, where the great athletic competitions were held that brought together Greeks from across the known world, Hestia's flame burned in a special chamber of the Prytaneum, and it had to remain lit for the entire duration of the games. If the flame was extinguished for any reason, it had to be rekindled using the heat of the sun itself, never from another flame, because only fire that came directly from the divine source could properly honor the goddess and sanctify the competition. This practice recognized that the flame was not just symbolic, it was understood as an actual presence. Hestia herself dwelling among the gathered athletes and spectators, blessing the games with her constancy and her commitment to peaceful competition and communal celebration. The modern Olympic torch, which is carried from city to city and kept burning throughout the games, is a direct descendant of this ancient practice, a recognition of Hestia's enduring influence even in our contemporary world. Though most people who watch the Olympic flame today know nothing of the goddess who inspired it, they are nonetheless participating in a ritual that honors her, that acknowledges the power of fire to unite communities and create sacred space for human excellence and achievement. Number. When Greek colonists set out to establish new settlements in distant lands, venturing across the Mediterranean to found cities in Sicily, southern Italy, the Black Sea coast, and beyond, they would take fire from the Prytaneum of their mother city, from Hestia's sacred hearth, and carry it with them on their journey. This flame would be used to light the first fire in the new colony, establishing a tangible connection between the old city and the new, ensuring that the colonists carried with them not just material goods and cultural practices, but also the actual presence of Hestia, the goddess who would protect and sustain them in their new home. This practice was profound in its implications. It meant that every Greek colony, no matter how distant from the mother city, remained connected to it through fire, through Hestia's eternal flame that burned in both places simultaneously. The colonists were not truly leaving home in the deepest sense, because they carried home with them in the form of sacred fire, in the presence of the goddess who embodied the very concept of home and belonging. And when they established their new Prytaneum, and kindled their own eternal flame from the fire they had carried across the seas, they were affirming their continued membership in the larger Greek community, their shared identity as people who gathered around Hestia's hearth. Hestia also maintained an eternal flame at Delphi in the Temple of Apollo, where her fire was considered a blessing to surrounding colonies and an essential element of the oracle's sacred function. The ever-burning fire there served multiple purposes. It provided warmth and light to the priestesses who delivered Apollo's prophecies. It sanctified the space where gods and mortals communicated, and it connected Delphi to the network of hearth fires that stretched across the Greek world, from Olympus itself down through every city and every home. In this way, Hestia's presence at Delphi reinforced the unity of Greek religious life, creating a system where the divine and the mortal, the cosmic and the domestic, were all held together by the continuous burning of sacred flame. The symbolism of this interconnected network of fires is worth contemplating, because it reveals something profound about how the Greeks understood community and identity. Every hearth fire in every home was connected to the flame in the city's Prytaneum, which was in turn connected to the flames in other cities, which were all ultimately connected back to Hestia's eternal fire on Olympus. Fire from one could kindle fire in another without diminishing the original. In fact, the sharing of flame was understood to strengthen rather than weaken the connection, to expand Hestia's presence rather than divide it. This created a kind of spiritual architecture where Hestia stood at the center of concentric circles of fire and community. First her own hearth on Olympus, then the hearths of the gods who gathered there, then the public hearths of Greek cities, then the domestic hearths within those cities, then the new hearths established in colonies that spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean world. Each flame was its own entity, yet also part of a larger whole. Each hearth was a center, yet also connected to other centers, and Hestia herself dwelled in all of them simultaneously, present wherever fire burned in her honor. Her tending of the Olympian flame was thus not separate from her care for mortal hearths. It was the source from which all other care flowed, the original flame from which all other flames were ultimately kindled, the divine work that made possible all the human work of maintaining homes and communities. When she added wood to the fire on Olympus, she was, in a sense, feeding every hearth fire in Greece, sustaining the entire network of flames that held civilization together. When she ensured that the Olympian flame never died, she was guaranteeing that no Greek hearth would ever be truly extinguished, that even if a particular fire went out, it could always be rekindled from other flames that traced their lineage back to her eternal care. The gods themselves benefited from this in ways both practical and symbolic. The hearth of Olympus provided warmth and light for their gatherings, but more importantly, it provided a center that made those gatherings meaningful, that transformed a collection of powerful individuals into something resembling a family. When the Olympians feasted together, they did so in the warmth of Hestia's flame, and the meal itself was sanctified by her presence, by the understanding that the first portions belonged to her before anyone else could eat. This practice mirrored the mortal custom and reinforced the connection between divine and human, reminding the gods that they too participated in the domestic rituals that Hestia governed. Hestia's work at the hearth was never dramatic, never showy, never the kind of thing that would inspire epic poems or grand artistic representations. There were no great battles fought over the right to tend the flame, no heroic quests undertaken to prove oneself worthy of standing at the hearth. The work was quiet, constant, requiring patience and presence rather than strength or cunning. But this quiet constancy was precisely what made it powerful, what gave it the ability to hold everything else together. Honestly, when you really think about the nature of Hestia's responsibility, the way she chose to bind herself to this single place, this single purpose, this never-ending task of maintaining the flame, it becomes clear that her power was of a completely different order from that of her siblings. Zeus's power was in command and control, in the ability to shape events through force of will and thunderbolt. Poseidon's power was in the vastness of his domain, in the storms he could summon and the earthquakes he could cause. Athena's power was in wisdom and strategy, in the ability to solve problems through intelligence and planning. But Hestia's power was in presence itself, in the simple, profound act of always being there, of never leaving, of maintaining the center around which all the others could orbit. The eternal flame she tended was a symbol that pointed towards something even deeper. The necessity of constancy in a world defined by change, the value of presence in a culture that celebrated movement and achievement, the power of staying when everything else encourages going. Hestia embodied this truth not through words or arguments, but through the daily, hourly, moment-by-moment work of keeping the fire alive, of ensuring that warmth and light never failed, of creating and maintaining the sacred space where others could gather safely. This made her the keeper of unity among gods and humans alike, because the fire she tended was the fire that brought people together, that transformed separate individuals into families and communities, that created the conditions where connection became possible. On Olympus, her flame united the often fractious divine family, giving them a shared center despite their differences. In mortal cities, her flame united citizens under a common identity, creating bonds of mutual obligation and shared purpose. In individual homes, her flame united family members around the hearth, where they could share meals and stories, and the simple gift of each other's presence. The flame never went out because Hestia never left, never tired, never decided that the work was too mundane or too limiting, never wished she had chosen differently when she refused Apollo and Poseidon and swore her oath of eternal virginity. She had found her purpose, and she fulfilled it completely, giving everything she was to the work of tending the eternal fire that held the world together, one constant flame burning at the center of everything. The reach of Hestia's influence extended far beyond the marble halls of Olympus, far beyond the grand mythological narratives that captivated poets and artists across the centuries. Her true power manifested in the most intimate spaces of human existence, in every city and every home where fire burned and families gathered. She became omnipresent in a way that no other Olympian could match, because she dwelled not in some distant realm accessible only through prayer and sacrifice, but in the very center of daily life, in the hearth that stood at the physical and spiritual heart of every Greek dwelling. Every household had a shrine to Hestia, though they might not have called it that. The hearth itself was her temple, and the fire that burned there was her constant presence, her blessing made tangible and warm. Think about what this means for a moment. In a pantheon filled with gods who required elaborate temples and formal ceremonies, whose worship demanded processions and priesthoods and complex rituals, Hestia was honored simply by the lighting of the morning fire, by the preparation of the daily meal, by the gathering of family members around the hearth at the end of the day. Her worship was woven so completely into the fabric of ordinary existence that it became almost invisible, not because she was unimportant, but because she was essential, present in every moment that involved fire and food and the gathered warmth of family. The ancient Greeks understood that they worshipped at her shrine daily, whether they consciously thought of it that way or not. The hearth in a Greek home was never just a practical appliance for cooking and warmth. It was a sacred space, an altar, the place where the mortal and divine intersected most intimately. When a mother lit the fire each morning, she was not simply preparing to cook breakfast. She was invoking Hestia's presence, asking the goddess to bless the household with another day of warmth and safety and domestic harmony. When the family gathered for their meal, the first portion of food was offered to Hestia, placed in the flames as a sacrifice before anyone else could eat, acknowledging that all nourishment came through her blessing, that the transformation of raw ingredients into edible food was itself a sacred act presided over by the goddess of the hearth. This practice of offering the first portion to Hestia was not optional or occasional. It was fundamental to Greek religious life, performed at every meal in every household, making her the most frequently honored of all the deities. Before prayers could be offered to Zeus or Poseidon or any other god, before libations could be poured or hymns sung, Hestia had to be acknowledged first, because the hearth was the means through which all other divine communication flowed. The fire itself became a kind of divine telephone, carrying mortal offerings up to the gods in the form of smoke and sacred flame, and Hestia controlled this essential channel of communication between human and divine realms. Her name literally means hearth or fireplace, which tells us something profound about how the Greeks understood both the goddess and the physical structure she embodied. They were inseparable, one and the same, the divine and the material so completely fused that speaking of one necessarily invoked the other. To say Hestia was to speak simultaneously of the goddess and the hearth, of the divine presence and the physical fire, of spiritual warmth and literal heat. This linguistic merging reflected a deeper truth about Greek religious sensibility. The divine was not distant or abstract, but rather present in the most ordinary objects and activities, accessible through the simple act of lighting a fire and gathering around its warmth. The hearth stood at the center of the house architecturally, and Hestia famously said that a house should be built around a hearth, making her also the goddess of building and architecture, the protector of homes, and the one who provided security through proper design and structure. This centrality was not accidental but intentional. reflecting a profound understanding of how domestic space should be organized. Everything else in the house oriented itself in relation to the hearth, which provided light, warmth, and the means of preparing food. The hearth was where life unfolded, where the daily rhythms of family existence played out against the backdrop of Hestia's eternal flame. Families gathered there to share meals, the most fundamental of human social activities, the breaking of bread together that transforms individuals into a community. They gathered there to tell stories, passing down the accumulated wisdom and experience of previous generations, creating continuity between past and present and future. They gathered there for warmth on cold nights, finding comfort in proximity to the fire and to each other, the physical warmth mirroring the emotional warmth of belonging and connection. And they gathered there to perform rituals that marked the major transitions of life, births and marriages and deaths, all occurred in the sacred space of the hearth, under Hestia's watchful presence. 2. When a child was born into a Greek family, one of the first ceremonies performed was the amphidromia, a ritual that occurred on the 5th or 7th day after birth. The newborn would be carried around the hearth in a circular motion, presented to Hestia and through her to the entire family, formally welcomed into the household as a recognized member. This ritual was not merely symbolic. It was understood as the moment when the child truly became part of the family, when the abstract possibility of a new person crystallized into the concrete reality of a son or daughter who belonged to this particular household, under the protection of this particular hearthfire, blessed by Hestia herself. The circle walked around the hearth represented the wholeness and unity of the family, the way all members were bound together in relation to the central fire. The hearth became the child's first altar, the place where they would first encounter the divine, the source of warmth and safety that would shape their understanding of what home meant. As they grew, they would learn to honor Hestia through daily practice, watching their parents offer the first portion of every meal to the flames, understanding that gratitude and reverence were expressed not through grand gestures, but through consistent, humble acknowledgement of the goddess who made domestic life possible. 2. Marriages too were intimately connected to Hestia's domain, because marriage was fundamentally about the creation of a new hearth, a new household, a new center around which family life would organize itself. When a bride left her father's house to join her husband's family, she carried with her fire from her childhood hearth flame that had burned in her family's home for generations, that represented the continuity of her lineage and the blessing of her ancestors. This fire would be used to kindle the first flame in the new household's hearth, establishing Hestia's presence there and ensuring that the new family would be protected and sustained by the same divine power that had watched over previous generations. The ritual acknowledged that the bride was not simply moving from one physical location to another. She was transferring her primary allegiance from one hearth to another, from one family unit to another, while still maintaining her connection to her birth family through the literal transfer of sacred fire. The flame that burned in her new home came from her old home, creating a physical link between the two households, a bond of fire that could not be broken even as the bride took on new responsibilities and formed new attachments. And when the newlyweds' own children eventually married and established their households, they too would carry fire from the parental hearth, extending the chain of flame forward through time, generation after generation, all ultimately connected back to Hestia's eternal fire on Olympus. Hospitality, xenia or philoxenia in Greek, meaning love of the stranger or guest friendship, was one of the most sacred duties in ancient Greek society, and it too was inextricably connected to Hestia's domain. When a guest arrived at a Greek home, they would be welcomed with the lighting or tending of the hearth fire, a ritual acknowledgement that they were being brought into the sacred space of the family, placed under Hestia's protection for the duration of their stay. To offer hospitality was to share one's hearth, to extend the warmth and safety of home to someone who was temporarily without either, and this sharing was understood as a religious obligation that Hestia herself enforced. The goddess ensured that those welcomed into a home were treated with kindness and respect, that hosts fulfilled their sacred duty to feed and shelter travelers, that the bonds of hospitality were honored and maintained. To violate the laws of Xenia, to harm a guest or to refuse hospitality to someone in need, was to offend Hestia directly, and such offences were taken with deadly seriousness in Greek society. The hearth fire itself bore witness to the promises made between host and guest, and Hestia was the guarantor of those promises, the divine presence that transformed ordinary human kindness into sacred obligation. In this way, every Greek home became a kind of temple, every family a congregation, every meal a religious ceremony. The domestic sphere was not separate from the religious sphere. They were one and the same, unified by Hestia's presence at the hearth, by the understanding that ordinary activities like cooking and eating and gathering together were themselves forms of worship when performed with proper reverence and gratitude. Hestia made the sacred accessible, brought the divine down from the heights of Olympus into the humble spaces where people actually lived their lives, where they struggled and celebrated and grieved and loved. But Hestia's influence extended beyond individual households into the civic sphere, where it took on even grander dimensions while maintaining the same essential character. Every Greek city-state had its Prytaneum, a public building that housed the communal hearth of the polis, where an eternal flame burned in Hestia's honour, just as the Olympian flame burned on the mountaintop, and just as smaller flames burned in individual homes throughout the city. This public hearth was the symbolic centre of the city-state, representing the unity of all citizens, the shared identity that bound them together as members of a common community. The Prytaneum served multiple functions, all of them intimately connected to Hestia's domain. It was where foreign ambassadors were received and entertained, where citizens who had performed exceptional service to the state were honoured with public meals, where important civic business was conducted under the blessing of the goddess's eternal flame. The building itself was understood as the home of the entire city, with Hestia as its presiding deity, the one who ensured that civic harmony was maintained, that the bonds of citizenship held firm despite inevitable conflicts and differences of opinion. Just as individual families offered the first portion of their meals to Hestia at the domestic hearth, the city as a collective body offered sacrifices at the public hearth, acknowledging that civic life depended on the goddess's blessing just as much as domestic life did. The flame that burned in the Prytaneum was never allowed to go out, tended day and night by appointed officials or priestesses who understood that maintaining the fire was not simply a ceremonial duty, but an essential task that affected the well-being of the entire community. If the public hearth fire was extinguished, it was considered a catastrophic omen, a sign that the city itself was in danger, that the unity and continuity represented by the flame had been compromised. When Greek colonists set out to establish new settlements, and the Greeks were prodigious colonizers, founding cities throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, they would take fire from the Prytaneum of their mother city and carry it with them on their journey across the seas. This practice was deeply significant, because it meant that the new colony, no matter how distant geographically, remained connected to the mother city through the literal transfer of sacred flame, through Hestia's presence carried from one hearth to another. The fire that burned in the new city's Prytaneum came from the old city's hearth, creating a bond that could not be broken even by vast distances or the passage of time. This maintained a spiritual connection that was understood to be just as real and important as any political or economic ties between the cities. The colonists were not simply Greek people living in a new place. They remained members of the extended family of their mother city, connected through fire, through Hestia's blessing, through the shared hearth that linked them across the waters. When conflicts arose between mother city and colony, when political interests diverged or economic competition created tensions, the shared flame served as a reminder of fundamental unity, of the bonds of kinship, and common heritage that transcended temporary disagreements. Hestia's role as unifying force extended to the entire Greek world, because every city's public hearth was understood to be connected ultimately to her eternal flame on Olympus, just as every domestic hearth was connected to the public hearth of its city. This created a vast network of sacred fires stretching across the entire Greek-speaking world, from Olympus down through the cities and into individual homes, all linked together through the continuous transmission of flame from one hearth to another, all blessed by the same goddess, all participating in the same essential act of tending the fire that made civilization possible. 9. The Greeks who lived in Athens were connected through fire to the Greeks who lived in Syracuse, in Marseille, in Alexandria, in the countless colonies and settlements that dotted the Mediterranean coastline. All of them gathered around hearths that traced their lineage back through mother cities to Hestia herself, all of them participating in the same rituals of offering the first portion to the goddess of the hearth, all of them understanding themselves as members of a culture defined in large part by the sacred fire that burned at its center. This made Hestia the quiet guardian of something essential, not just individual families or individual cities, but the entire network of relationships and shared practices that constituted Greek civilization itself. She was the goddess of domestic harmony, yes, ensuring that families could function smoothly, that meals could be prepared and shared, that children could be raised in warmth and safety. But she was also the goddess of civic order, the one who maintained the bonds that held cities together, who ensured that the public sphere functioned as an extension of the domestic sphere, who reminded citizens that their city was itself a kind of enlarged household, requiring the same care and tending as any family home. Her influence brought peace, not through force or intimidation, but through the creation of sacred space where conflict could be set aside, where people could gather in the warmth of shared fire and remember their common humanity. The hearth was neutral territory, belonging to everyone and therefore to no one in particular, a place where hierarchies and rivalries could temporarily dissolve in the face of more fundamental truths about human need and human connection. Hestia fostered unity both within families and within the larger society, maintaining the bonds between family members and between citizens, ensuring that the social fabric remained intact despite the constant pressures that threatened to tear it apart. On Olympus itself, her hearth remained neutral territory where any god could go for rest, where none of them could fight, where the usual conflicts and competitions that characterized divine relationships had to be temporarily suspended out of respect for Hestia's sacred space. This was a remarkable achievement, to create a place of peace in the midst of the often chaotic and violent world of the Olympians, to establish a zone where even the most bitter rivals had to set aside their differences and honor the sanctuary of the hearth. The other gods acknowledged her hearth as special, protected, inviolable, not because Hestia had the power to enforce this recognition through strength of arms, but because they understood instinctively that some spaces must remain peaceful if any social order is to function at all. This same principle operated in mortal Greek society, where the hearth served as a place of sanctuary for those who needed protection. Someone who had been wronged or threatened could claim asylum at a hearth, and custom dictated that they could not be harmed while under Hestia's protection. The goddess's presence sanctified the space, transformed it into holy ground where violence was forbidden, where even enemies had to recognize a higher law than their personal grievances. This made her the protector of the vulnerable, the defender of those who had nowhere else to turn, the one who ensured that mercy and compassion would have space to operate even in the midst of conflicts that might otherwise end in bloodshed. Boo. Her symbols reflected her humble, essential nature. She was often depicted with a flower pot or kettle, implements of domestic life rather than the dramatic weapons or tokens of power that characterized other deities' iconography. The flower pot represented growth and nurturing, the patient tending of living things that characterized her approach to family and community. The kettle represented the transformation of raw ingredients into nourishment, the alchemical work of cooking that turned separate elements into unified sustenance. These were not glamorous symbols, not the stuff of epic poetry or heroic tales, but they were profoundly meaningful to the people who used them daily, who understood that kettles and flower pots were instruments through which Hestia's blessing manifested in their lives. She was also associated with the circle, that perfect geometric form that represents unity, wholeness, the cyclical nature of domestic life with its daily and seasonal rhythms. The circle has no beginning and no end, just as Hestia's flame burns eternally without starting point or conclusion, just as the work of tending home and family is never truly finished, but continues generation after generation in an endless cycle of care and maintenance. To walk in a circle around the hearth was to participate in this eternal pattern, to affirm one's place in the continuous flow of family life that stretched backward into the past and forward into the future. Her presence brought warmth in the most literal sense, the physical heat that made homes habitable, that kept families alive through cold winters, that provided the means of cooking food and purifying water. But she also brought warmth in the metaphorical sense, the emotional comfort of belonging, the security of knowing there was a place where one was always welcome, the peace that comes from being surrounded by people who care about your well-being. These two kinds of warmth were inseparable in Hestia's domain, because the Greeks understood that physical comfort and emotional security were intertwined, that a properly tended hearth provided both simultaneously. She brought light as well, again both literally and metaphorically. The hearth fire illuminated homes before the development of other lighting technologies, allowing families to see each other after dark, to continue their activities and conversations into the evening hours, to extend the day beyond what the sun alone would permit. But the light she provided was also spiritual illumination, the clarity that comes from proper understanding of one's place in the cosmic order, the wisdom that recognizes the sacred in the ordinary, the insight that sees divine blessing in daily bread. And she brought continuity, perhaps her most precious gift of all. The eternal nature of her flame represented the unbroken chain of family and civic life stretching across generations, the promise that some things would endure despite all the changes and losses that inevitably occur in mortal existence. As long as the hearth fire burned, as long as families gathered around it and cities maintained their public flames, the connection to past and future remained intact, the thread of continuity held firm. Honestly, when you really consider the scope of Hestia's presence in Greek life, the way she dwelled simultaneously on Olympus and in every city and in every home, the way her worship was inseparable from the most basic activities of daily existence, the way her blessing was invoked thousands of times each day across the entire Greek world, it becomes clear that she was perhaps the most intimately present of all the deities, the one whose influence touched the most lives most frequently. She might not have had epic adventures or dramatic love affairs, she might not have been the subject of elaborate myths and legends, but she was there, constantly, reliably, in the flame that burned at the center of every hearth, in the warmth that radiated from every fire, in the peace and unity that characterized properly maintained domestic and civic spaces. She was the quiet guardian, operating not through loud proclamations or visible interventions, but through the steady, patient work of maintaining the fires that held civilization together. She watched over families as they navigated the challenges of daily life, blessed their meals and their gatherings, protected their homes, and ensured their continuity. She watched over cities as they developed their civic institutions, blessed their public ceremonies and their collective decisions, maintained the unity that allowed diverse citizens to function as a coherent community. And she did all of this quietly, humbly, without demanding recognition or praise beyond the simple offering of first portions and the daily tending of flame. Every hearth, every public fire, every flame lit in her honor, all belonged to her, all manifested her presence, all served as points of contact between the mortal and divine realms. Through this vast network of sacred fires, she became omnipresent in a way that even Zeus himself could not match. Because while Zeus might rule from on high and occasionally intervene in human affairs, Hestia dwelled constantly in the heart of every home and every city, as close as the nearest flame, as present as the warmth on your face when you stood before the fire. She was the quiet guardian of domestic harmony and civic order, the goddess whose blessing made possible all the small, essential moments that constitute a life well lived, a family well tended, a community well maintained. The moment arrived quietly, as was fitting for Hestia. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no divine spectacle that shook the foundations of Olympus. Instead, there was simply a decision made with the same clarity and conviction that had characterized all of her choices, a recognition of what was needed and a willingness to provide it, even at personal cost. The Olympian Council had 12 seats, 12 thrones, arranged in the great hall where the gods gathered to make their pronouncements and exercise their collective authority over the cosmos. Hestia held one of these seats as the eldest daughter of Cronus and Rhea, as one of the original 6 who had been swallowed and then freed, who had fought alongside Zeus to establish the new divine order. Ominous. But the number 12 had become problematic, not because there was anything inherently wrong with it, but because Dionysus had arrived on Olympus, and his claim to divine status could not be easily dismissed. He was Zeus's son, born of mortal woman but elevated through divine power to full godhood, patron of wine and revelry, ecstasy and liberation, his cult spreading across Greece with a fervor that demanded recognition. Dionysus represented something new in the Olympian order, the possibility of transformation, of mortals becoming divine, of boundaries being crossed that had previously seemed absolute. His presence was disruptive in the best and worst senses, challenging established hierarchies, forcing the other gods to reconsider assumptions they had taken for granted. The question became unavoidable. Should Dionysus be granted a seat among the 12 Olympians, and if so, whose place would he take? The asking of this question created tension that threatened to fracture the carefully maintained peace of the divine family, because no one wanted to give up their throne, their status, their formal recognition as one of the ruling powers. Zeus was caught in an impossible position. He could not deny his own son the honor that Dionysus clearly deserved, but neither could he force one of the established Olympians to step down without creating resentment that would poison relationships for millennia to come. Arguments erupted in the great hall, gods and goddesses defending their positions, explaining why their domains were too essential to be relegated to secondary status. Poseidon pointed to the vastness of the seas under his command, Hera to her role as queen of the gods, Athena to her wisdom and her patronage of civilization itself. Apollo spoke of the sun and prophecy, Artemis of the wilderness and the hunt, Ares of war and martial valor. Each had compelling reasons to remain, each represented functions that could not easily be dismissed or diminished. The conflict grew more heated with each passing day, threatening to become the kind of divine feud that could spill over into the mortal world, that could drag cities and heroes into taking sides, that could tear apart the very fabric of the order the Olympians had worked so hard to establish. Entire Hestia watched all of this from her place at the hearth, listened to the arguments and the posturing, observed the way pride and defensiveness were beginning to harden into genuine anger. She saw the pattern developing, the way small disagreements could snowball into major conflicts, the way the need to defend one's position could become more important than the actual substance of what was being defended, the way ego could poison even the best-intentioned gatherings. She had seen it before in smaller forms, had witnessed countless family disputes where the original issue became lost in the subsequent battle over who was right and who was wrong, who deserved more respect and who deserved less. And she understood something that perhaps the others did not, something that her particular vantage point at the hearth had taught her through centuries of observation. Someone had to be willing to step back, to sacrifice personal status for the sake of collective peace, to choose harmony over honor when the two came into conflict. The hearth did not need a throne to function, and Hestia did not need formal recognition among the 12 to continue her essential work. Her power came from her presence, from her constant tending of the flame, from the daily worship offered by mortals at countless hearths across the Greek world. None of this depended on whether she sat on a throne in the Olympian council or stood by the fire maintaining it. So she made her choice, the same way she had chosen to refuse Apollo and Poseidon's marriage proposals, the same way she had chosen to swear the oath of eternal virginity, with quiet certainty, with no need for others' approval or understanding, with absolute conviction that she was doing what needed to be done. She approached Zeus during a lull in the arguments, when the other gods had temporarily exhausted themselves with debate and were taking time to regroup and plan new strategies for defending their positions. The great hall was relatively quiet, just the crackling of the hearth fire and the sound of her footsteps approaching her brother's throne. "I will give up my seat," she said simply, her voice calm and clear, carrying none of the emotional weight that the other gods had been bringing to their pronouncements. "Dionysus may have my place among the 12, and I will remain here at the hearth where I have always been most comfortable, where my work is centered and my purpose most clearly expressed." The silence that followed her words was profound, the kind of stillness that comes when something genuinely unexpected has occurred, when the pattern everyone assumed would continue has suddenly shifted in a way that changes everything. Zeus stared at his sister, trying to determine if she was making some kind of political maneuver, if there was a hidden agenda behind the offer. The other Olympians exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond to someone voluntarily giving up power rather than fighting to accumulate more of it. But Hestia meant exactly what she said, with no hidden motivations or secret resentments. She simply recognized that the throne was less important than the peace it could purchase, that her formal status among the 12 was less valuable than the resolution of a conflict that threatened to tear apart the divine family. Her withdrawal was not surrender or defeat. It was a conscious choice to prioritize what mattered most, to remain true to the values she had always embodied, even when doing so required sacrifice. Zeus accepted her offer with gratitude and perhaps a touch of relief. Here was a solution that allowed Dionysus to be honored without forcing Zeus to choose between his other children and siblings, without creating the bitter resentments that would have followed if he had ordered someone to step down against their will. Dionysus took Hestia's throne, and she returned to the hearth, to the place where she had always spent most of her time anyway, to the work that had always been more central to her identity than any formal title or position. In some myths, it is said that she preferred to withdraw from godly affairs entirely, that she was sure of a fond welcome in any mortal city she chose, and therefore had no need to maintain her position among the sometimes petty and quarrelsome Olympians. This version of the story suggests that Hestia saw clearly the difference between the theatricality of divine politics and the genuine substance of her work among mortals, that she chose authenticity over status, meaningful service over empty honors. She knew that in every Greek city, in every home where a hearth fire burned, she would be welcomed and revered, that her actual influence and importance did not depend on whether she sat on a throne in Zeus's hall. The choice to give up her seat embodied everything that made Hestia unique among the Olympians. Her humility, her wisdom, her ability to see past surface appearances to deeper truths about what truly mattered. Where other gods fought endlessly for status and recognition, where power struggles defined so much of Olympian existence, Hestia demonstrated a different way of being, a different understanding of what constituted real power and real success. She showed that sometimes the strongest position is the one that doesn't need to be defended, that the most secure status is the one that comes from actual function rather than formal title. Her withdrawal from the Council of 12 was not weakness. It was the ultimate expression of strength, the confidence to let go of what others desperately clung to because she knew her value did not depend on external validation. She could afford to give up her throne because she had never really needed it in the first place, because her identity was rooted in her work rather than in the recognition she received for that work, because she understood herself completely and did not require others' acknowledgement to feel secure in her purpose. The act also revealed something about the nature of simplicity and how it differs from poverty or lack. Hestia's choice to live humbly by the hearth rather than to sit in splendor on a throne was not forced on her by circumstances beyond her control, but rather freely chosen because she recognized that simplicity served her purposes better than grandeur ever could. She had access to all the wealth and status that came with being an Olympian, could have insisted on maintaining her formal position, could have fought for her seat the way the others were fighting for theirs. Instead, she chose the humble position, the background role, the unglamorous work of tending the fire that most people take for granted until it goes out. This voluntary simplicity was profoundly countercultural in the context of Olympian life, where excess and display were the norm, where gods competed to see who could be most magnificent, most impressive, most worthy of mortal awe and worship. Hestia rejected this entire framework, choosing instead a life defined by constancy rather than spectacle, by presence rather than performance, by the patient maintenance of essential things rather than the dramatic assertion of personal glory. Her hearth required no gold or jewels to be sacred. Her fire needed no elaborate rituals to be holy. The simplicity itself was the point, the stripping away of everything non-essential to reveal what truly mattered. In choosing this path, she embodied balance in the truest sense, not the static balance of opposing forces held in perfect equilibrium, but rather the dynamic balance of knowing when to act and when to yield, when to claim space and when to make space for others, when to insist on recognition and when to step back and let the work speak for itself. She balanced the masculine drive for achievement and status that characterized so much of Olympian culture with a feminine wisdom that recognized the value of receptivity, of creating space, of tending what already exists, rather than always striving to create something new and more impressive. Her withdrawal also balanced the centrifugal forces that constantly threatened to fragment the Olympian family. By giving up her throne, she prevented a conflict that could have spun out of control, that could have created permanent rifts among the gods. Her sacrifice was the counterweight that allowed the system to stabilize, that created room for Dionysus without requiring Zeus to force anyone else out, that modeled a way of resolving disputes through voluntary yielding rather than through victory and defeat. The Greeks who knew her story understood what she had done and why it mattered. They saw in her withdrawal not diminishment, but elevation, not loss of status, but affirmation of the values that made her most worthy of honor. A goddess who would give up her throne to maintain peace was a goddess who truly understood what mattered, who had her priorities properly ordered, who embodied the kind of wisdom that transcended mere cleverness or strategic thinking. She became, in this act, even more clearly the moral center of Olympus, the one whose judgment could be trusted because she was not invested in personal gain, whose advice was worth hearing because she had demonstrated her freedom from the ego-driven calculations that distorted so many divine decisions. Nah. Her life by the hearth after giving up her throne was not essentially different from her life before. She had always spent most of her time there anyway, had always found her purpose in the tending of the flame rather than in the formal councils and gatherings of the Olympian 12. But the choice to make this preference official, to formally relinquish status in order to more fully embrace her calling, deepened the significance of her work and clarified for everyone what she truly valued. It was a declaration that the hearth was not a consolation prize for those who couldn't achieve higher status, but rather the highest calling, the most essential work, the place where real power manifested in its most beneficial form. Tao. She remained at the hearth, tending the eternal flame with the same patience and dedication she had always brought to the work, her hands moving with practiced grace as she maintained the fire that held everything together. The other gods continued their various pursuits, Zeus thundered and ruled, Poseidon churned the seas, Apollo raced his chariot across the sky, Artemis hunted in wild places, Athena guided heroes and cities, Aphrodite stirred passions, Ares gloried in conflict, Hephaestus forged in his workshop, Demeter governed the harvest cycles, Hera managed her complicated marriage, and Dionysus brought his particular form of liberating madness to mortals who needed to break free from their constraints. Through all of this constant activity and drama, Hestia remained still, centered, present at the hearth, creating the stable foundation that allowed all the other gods to pursue their various interests without the whole system collapsing into chaos. Time. Her staying was what enabled their going. Her constancy, what made possible their changes. Her humble position, what supported their grand achievements. The hearth she tended was the axis around which the entire Olympian world turned, and she was content to be that axis, to serve that function, to provide that essential stability, even when it meant giving up external recognition and formal status. This was not martyrdom or self-sacrifice in the painful sense. It was alignment with her deepest nature, the fulfillment of her truest calling, the expression of who she had always been, but now with even greater clarity and conviction. The mortals who worshipped her understood this better than many of the gods. They knew that the person who tends the hearth is performing work that makes all other work possible, that the humble position is often the most powerful one, that simplicity and constancy are precious gifts in a world obsessed with novelty and achievement. Every time they lit their hearth fires, every time they offered the first portion of their meals to Hestia, every time they gathered around the flame to share stories and warmth, they were honoring not just a goddess, but a set of values, a way of being in the world that prioritized presence over performance, service over status, the maintenance of what matters over the endless striving for more. Tiana Hestia's withdrawal from her throne became, in this way, one of her greatest teachings, a demonstration that real power doesn't need to advertise itself, that genuine importance doesn't require external validation, that the work itself is sufficient reward for those who understand its value. She lived by the hearth in humility, not because she had been humbled, but because she recognized humility as the appropriate posture for her work, the stance that allowed her to serve most effectively, the position from which she could most fully embody the values she represented. Balance, in her understanding, was not about equal portions or perfect symmetry. It was about right proportion, about giving each thing its proper weight and attention, about knowing when more was needed and when less would serve better. She balanced the Olympian tendency toward excess with her own preference for sufficiency, the divine love of glory with her quiet dedication to duty, the eternal striving for individual greatness with the recognition that community and connection matter more than personal achievement. She was the counterweight to a culture that constantly pushed for bigger, brighter, more impressive, reminding everyone through her presence and her choices that small can be powerful, quiet can be influential, and simple can be profound. Pala. And so she remained, after giving up her throne, exactly where she had always been, at the hearth, tending the flame, creating the warmth and light and sacred space that allowed life to flourish. The fire burned on, as it had burned since the beginning of the Olympian age, as it would burn until the end of time itself, never flickering, never failing, a constant presence in an inconstant world. Hestia's hands added wood to the flames, adjusted the fuel for optimal burning, ensured that everything was as it should be. She did this work not because anyone forced her to, not because she had failed to achieve higher status, but because she had chosen it freely, had recognized it as her calling, had understood that some work is too important to be left to those who perform it only out of obligation rather than love. Her withdrawal from Olympus, whether understood literally as a physical departure to dwell among mortals, or metaphorically as a stepping back from divine politics, was the final expression of her character, the ultimate statement of her values, the completion of the pattern she had been tracing since the moment she emerged from Cronus's belly and chose the hearth as her domain. She had refused marriage to maintain her independence and focus. She had sworn eternal virginity to preserve her singular dedication. She had claimed the hearth when others claimed kingdoms and oceans and skies. And finally, she had given up her throne to preserve peace and model a different way of being powerful. Each choice built on the previous ones. Each decision reinforced her core identity. Each sacrifice revealed what she truly valued and what she was willing to let go. Together, they created a portrait of a goddess, unlike any other in the Greek pantheon, one who measured success not by how much power she could accumulate, but by how well she could serve, who found fulfillment not in being celebrated, but in being useful, who understood that the greatest honor is not to be constantly honored, but to do work worthy of honor, whether anyone notices or not. Honestly, there's something beautiful about the completeness of Hestia's story, the way every element fits together to reveal a coherent vision of what it means to live with integrity and purpose. From her paradoxical beginning as both eldest and youngest, through her choice of the hearth as her domain, her refusal of marriage, her oath of virginity, her tending of the eternal flame, her presence in every home and city, to finally her withdrawal from her throne. Every part of the narrative points toward the same truths about what truly matters, about where real power resides, about how to live in balance with oneself and one's purpose. She embodied simplicity, not as poverty but as clarity, humility, not as weakness but as wisdom, constancy, not as boring repetition but as faithful presence. She showed that it's possible to be fully oneself without needing to dominate others, to have immense influence without wielding coercive power, to be absolutely essential without demanding recognition. The hearth she tended on Olympus, in the Prytaneum of every city, in every Greek home, stood as testament to her vision of what the sacred could be when stripped of unnecessary ornamentation and returned to its most basic, most powerful form. Just fire, just warmth, just light, just the gathered presence of those who belonged together. Nothing more was needed, and nothing less would do. And so the story of Hestia concludes where it began, at the hearth, with the flame burning steadily, with the goddess tending it in humble dedication, creating warmth for others to share, maintaining light for others to see by, holding the center so that everything else can find its proper place in orbit around her eternal fire.